Welcome back to my channel for another Leica episode, and this episode is about zone focusing, which is a feature that is built in on the Leica SL3, the Leica SL3-S, and also on the predecessor Leica SL2 and Leica SL3-S. And in my humble opinion, it's a feature not many people are aware of, and the benefit you get once you understood it, once you start to use it, is huge for your shooting. So that's what this video is about, and let me start by showing a Leica-M lens here. And for the Leica-M lenses, we typically have the aperture ring with the beautiful clicks. Listen to the sound. Just beautiful. And then we have a distance scale, and we also have a depth of field scale. And by this, I can figure out on the lens how to set up my lens in a way that in a certain range, everything is reasonably sharp and in focus, and outside things will get fuzzy. And with, let's say, in particular, wide-angle lenses, you can leverage this for your benefit, in particular in street photography, because you don't have to focus at all. You just set everything up on the lens, and then, of course, the camera parameters, so ISO value, for instance, shutter speed, and so on. But you preset everything on the camera and the lens, and then you can fully focus on image composition, and don't have to bother about the manual focus on a rangefinder camera from the Leica-M segment, or the autofocus system in the Leica SL3-S and Leica SL3, which for some people still is not fast enough. And I agree with that. It's not the fastest autofocus system in the world, but Leica has built in an ingenious feature for zone focusing, which is using the top display, and that's what I want to explain in this video. Let's kick this off. Alright, so what is zone focusing all about? Let's assume on the left hand side here we have a Leica SL3. Currently the Super Vario Elmarit SL 14 to 24mm is mounted. On the right hand side we have a subject, in this case a person, fully in white. The focus is sitting on the person and the focus point is at 3 meters. Then of course we have a depth of field, and the depth of field has a near focus, which is 2.5 meters here, and a far focus, which is 3.5 meters. And within this 1 meter range, everything can be considered acceptably sharp. That's the starting point of my discussion here. Now the Leica SL3 and the SL3-S, and also its predecessors by the way, they have an ingenious feature built in, namely that in manual focus, you can actually make the near focus, the focus point, and the far focus being displayed in the top display of the camera. And I've illustrated this here. I'm also showing this live in a moment in a demonstration. And you see the near limit here is called by Leica front. The far limit is called back. And where the focus is sitting, in my example here at 3 meters, this is called by Leica focus. Of course, you can have a more narrow depth of field. Here, the depth of field is only 20 centimeters from 2.9 meters to 3.1 meters. Everything I'm showing here is illustrative, of course. You can have a wider depth of field. So here the depth of field is 2.5 meters and starts from 2 meters and goes up to 4.5 meters, where the focus point is still sitting at 3 meters. And you can use this now for your benefit, which I'm going to demonstrate live in a moment, for 0 seconds focusing time. And that is something which is very interesting. I use a lot in street on my Leica Q3, on my Leica-M cameras, and you can also use it in a very convenient way on the Leica SL3 and Leica SL3-S. And this is a live example, but it's not taken with the 14 to 24mm Super Vario Elmarit lens, but with a 50mm aposummicron. And I'm going to show this later in a live demonstration. But if I focus at 18 meters and I have the aperture at f8, and as I said, my focal length is 50mm, everything from 9.1 meter on up to infinity will be sharp, and everything in this range will be in focus. And that is super convenient. That means, for instance, if you have a wide angle lens, I was using here 50mm as said, a wide angle lens, you can actually use this in perfect ways for street photography without ever bothering about manual focus or the autofocus system. You just set up your camera for zone focusing in a way I'm showing you in a moment when we come to hyperfocal distance, and then you can just always take the shot. Just pressing down the shutter release button will give you a sharp image in that depth of field area, which will start from a certain point on and will go up to infinity, which is super convenient. It's the fastest way to take focus because there is zero delay. That's why I say this is 0 seconds focusing time here. And the best way to do this, of course, is to remember what the hyperfocal distance is. And the hyperfocal distance is the closest distance at which a lens can be focused while keeping objects at infinity acceptably sharp. And what happens is, if I focus here at the hyperfocal distance, then from half of that distance on up to infinity, as you see in the illustration here, everything will be sharp and in focus. And that's the best way to get the widest depth of field. And if you use an appropriate lens with appropriate settings and parameters, including setting your aperture in a certain way, you actually get the camera to always have everything from a close distance starting on up to infinity being in focus. So you will never again lose time with autofocusing. And in particular in street photography, that's a big plus, because you want to catch that particular moment. Sometimes, you know, the lens is hunting forth and back before it finds focus. This is all gone with zone focusing, and then you know from half of the hyperfocal distance on up to infinity, everything will be sharp. Let's make a couple of examples here in order to illustrate what that means. For street photography, I typically use wide angle lenses, definitely wider than 50mm, sometimes 50mm if it really is about people portraits and all of that. And if you take here, for example, the lens in my image here, which is mounted, the 14 to 24mm, and I choose a focal length of 24mm, I have to square the focal length and divide it by the f-stop times the circle of confusion. And for full frame sensors, the best ballpark figure for that number, which I called little c here, is 0.03. If I do the calculation, I end up at 2.4 meter as the hyperfocal distance. And that means everything from basically 1.2 meter up to infinity will be sharp. And this is ideal for street photography, right? I'm repeating myself. Everything from, let's give or take, a meter distance to me up to infinity will be sharp. No delays any longer by autofocus or manually trying to focus your lens. If you go to a longer focal length, like 50mm, which is the one mounted on my SL3-S for my live demonstration here, we square the 50, we divide by an aperture of f8 times the circle of confusion, 0.03, and then the hyperfocal distance is 10.42 meter. And that's still good for street photography, because you want to keep a certain distance to what you are taking photos of. And this means at roughly 5 meter, from 5 meter on up to infinity, everything will be sharp and in focus. No more delays with focusing, zero focusing time. And that is kind of ingenious. Of course, I can back up these numbers to 2.4 meter for the 24mm focal length and the 10.42 meter for the 50mm focal length by depth of field calculators like this one here from PhotoPills. Is an app I always have on my iPhone. And you see here they have a slightly different number. They come up with 2.42 meter. I came up with 2.4 meter. But you know, there are slightly different variations of that formula for hyperfocal distance. I used a certain one and the results are very close. In the same way you see this on the 50mm lens, 10.42 meter is my calculation result, 10.45 meter is what the app is telling me. And then you see the depth of field near limit for the 24mm lens is 1.21 meter. So right in front of my face and in front of the camera, and the far limit is infinity. So everything from about 1.2 meter on will be acceptably sharp and in focus. And on the 50mm lens, it's everything from 5+ meter on up to infinity will be in focus. Absolutely ingenious concept for street photography and for whenever it counts that you don't have any delays in your autofocus or manual focus, and your focusing time needs to be zero. Okay, now I want to do a live demonstration how to use zone focusing on the Leica SL3-S, and it's exactly the same on the Leica SL3. So if you look here, I'm here in aperture priority, currently widest open at f2.0. I'm in manual focusing mode here, which is good, that's what I want. Since in front of the camera we have a dragon, I'm on animal detection beta, which is good. We have center weighted metering, and we are on single in terms of drive mode. So that's what we have. Now if I half press the shutter button, I return to live view, and I can now manually focus. I have magnification switched on for manual focus, so it automatically crops into the scene. That's also nice. And what I showed in one of my tutorials on the Leica SL3 and SL3-S is that you can customize the joystick to actually support you in manual focus with autofocus. So I show quickly again how this is working. You go to customize control and then you go to joystick, And then in the autofocus mode, I have this typically on auto exposure lock, but you can also have autofocus on. And I have here on manual focus now, autofocus single. Of course, if the dragon would move, which is highly unlikely, I could go to autofocus continuous. And now what happens is if I'm in live view and I can manually focus, I can also use the support by this joystick by pressing it. And you see it detects in animal detection the body of the dragon, and you see this by this green rectangle. So that's actually a very nice feature. Of course, you can go into manual focus again, but if you want the support because you think you're not quick enough in your manual focusing, so push the joystick and the dragon will be nicely in focus on its main body, not on the wings, but on the main body. The way to see now this focus front and back parameters is that you here manually focus and then you half press the shutter button. Have a look at that. And currently it says front 0.59 meter, focus 0.6 meter, back 0.6 meter. I'm widest open at f2.0, so we have very shallow depth of field. Watch now what happens if I stop down the aperture. You will see that the depth of field increases. We are now already between 0.57 and 0.63. Since the dragon is in a near distance, we'll not achieve a lot here. But if we would stop down to, let's say, f22, which clearly will trigger some diffraction, we now have a depth of field from 0.55 meter to 0.66 meter. And the moment in time I start to open the aperture wider, that depth of field is narrowing and we come back to the former values. So here we are now at f2.0 and then it's from 0.59 to 0.60. So we can probably get, for instance, the eyes of the dragon sharp and in focus, but the teeth very likely will already be a little bit fuzzy. So that's the way it works. It's actually very simple. I want to now quickly illustrate the zone focusing example for, let's say, landscape photography, which I had before in the presentation. If you remember, I was going here to an f8.0 in the presentation and I was focusing at 18 meter. Let's do this. Let's go here and let's see where we get to 18 meter. You see how the three parameters, front, focus and back, are updating continuously as long as I'm turning the focus ring here. Let's go on focus to 18 meter, which was in the example. Here we go. And then you see the depth of field starts basically at close to 9 meter, 8.8, and extends to infinity, which is a perfect setup where from now on, if I want to have this in terms of focus, I don't have to use autofocus at all or manual focus. I just set up the camera as it is here and everything from, let's say, 9 meter up to infinity will always be sharp. So I can take a shot, I can take another shot, another shot, another shot. I don't have to bother about focus any longer and whether the scene I want to capture is sharp and nicely in focus. I can just take the shot and fully focus myself on the image composition. And of course, if you have a wider angle lens, like the 24mm example which I made in the presentation, this is ideal for street photography. Let's say from illustratively 3 meter to infinity, everything will be sharp and in focus if I use a 24mm lens here. And with this, I don't have to bother about focus any longer and have lightning fast focus because it's all pre-set up on the camera. Alright, I hope you liked this video. So in many ways, I always like to have this type of mechanism with aperture, distance scale and depth of field indication on a lens. And we don't have that in the Leica SL system. See, these are minimalistic lenses. The only information you get here is 21mm focal length, that's it. And then of course, if you open it up, you see this is a super aposummicron, 21mm widest open aperture is an f2, and so on and so on. But there is no distance scale, there is no depth of field indication on the lens. And these nice engravings which you have on the Leica-M lenses, they are not on the Leica SL system. But Leica has found a way to nevertheless make the information which is on these lenses available to us, as I showed to you, on the top display of the Leica SL3 and the SL3-S. And that's what I wanted to demonstrate in this video. You basically can use your Leica SL3 and SL3-S for range finding, zone focusing, what have you. And if you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.